now it's time to give word to Angely Berlis, so I will very shortly introduce Angely. She's a theologian, historian. She teaches at the University in Bern in Switzerland, Old Catholic theology, history of theology or Christian history. She also is active in interfaith dialogue, and I think more we'll hear from her.
So thank you very much for this very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here with you, and I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. The invitation reaches back a few months ago when we were together at the Societas Ecumenica in Warsaw, and at that meeting or conference, we spoke also about Nicaea in a very broad way. We addressed several questions about it. So today I'm in your midst to to speak about the legacy of Nicaea. Since some time, the Council of Nicaea becomes more prominent on the agenda of theology and on the agenda of churches. This is, of course, due to the 1700th anniversary in 2025 and the many events and publications that are happening. And this meeting, this conference of the Societas Ecumenica was only one of them. They themselves, those happenings, those events, those publications themselves contribute to the attention for this council. Because if everybody speaks about it, then it seems to be very important. But we know, of course, that churches deal with the Nicene faith in very different ways. In some churches, like my own, the Swiss Old Catholic Church, in some churches the Nicene Creed is prayed in every Sunday Eucharist. In other churches, songs are sung that are at least refer to the Creed. For example, they refer to the Trinity. And there are other churches where the Nicene Creed is only very exceptionally confessed. In Switzerland, on the initiative of the National Council of Churches, we are currently preparing an evensong on 1st June next year, where the Nicene Creed will be sung by choirs from different traditions, and it will be sung and confessed several times during this one evensong. The preparation of this common evensong gives us the opportunity to discuss about the essentials of the Nicene Creed. And this is very good, because that we become aware how deep the Nicene Creed has impregnated our prayer life, the individual and the communal prayer life, and how deeply also it has infected or impregnated our being Christian. When we, for example, say in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, we actually use a shortcut of this confession of Nicaea. So I want to clarify, the interesting thing is that in the title of my paper, the legacy of Nicaea, this is a very open title. You do not find the word creed or faith in it. And so I was very glad that there is not this word, because then it gives me the opportunity to clarify. So when we talk about the legacy of Nicaea, and you will see that I will refer mainly to the Council of Nicaea, the first Council of Nicaea of 325, but I also will speak about the Nicene faith. And first of all, I think that from our perspective today, it is too difficult to discern between the Nicene Creed and the Creed, how it was reformulated at the Council of Constantinople. The Council of Constantinople in 381. So when we confess the Creed, it is always the Creed of Nicaea and Constantinople. In German it's very difficult, so I always have difficulty. I don't know how it is called in Czech, The Niceno-Constantinopolitanum, the same. Also like a little bit difficult to say it, you have to concentrate when you say it. But we speak always, when we speak about the Nicene Creed now, the effect, of course, of most of us, if they are not historians, we are speaking in fact about the Nicene and Constantinopolitan Creed. And of course, the reformulation, the addition in 381, was then also by the Church received as an authentic expression of the Nicene faith. Therefore, I would propose not only to speak about the faith, how it was agreed upon in Nicaea 325, but also how it was received in later times. And this is my second point of clarification, next to the question of Nicene Creed or Nicene faith, the word reception. Reception is a very important part of the recognition of a council. So the Nicene faith was formulated in a certain historical context with certain historically, philosophically, theologically framed reflection and wording. I think Philip will later come back to this wording. And it is, in this context, it was formulated, it is a lived faith throughout time, and it was experienced by people, handed over to each generation, to be interpreted and lived under specific circumstances and in specific surroundings and contexts. So what I, just to say short, what I want to tell you is that, of course, this text was formulated in a certain context and is also impregnated by certain ideas and concepts. But of course, by handing it down through the generations, and that is of course what faith is about, it's not only a text, but it is also always an experience, as a confessed text, it is also received. And for several decades now, the aspect of reception has become much more prominent in ecumenical discourse. And of course, when it is talked about in ecumenical discourse, it is not only about the individual receiving and living, but it's the reception by the Church of a council. Sometimes we speak also about reception of ecumenical insights and texts. And this is one aspect of reception. I think in ecumenical movement it's very important that we sometimes even do not know anymore that we have received some concepts, some ideas and so forth. But we use it. For example, the way we talk about baptism, that it is possible to recognize baptism from other churches. This is a result from ecumenical dialogue, from ecumenical thought, and from ecumenical reception. There is also another aspect of reception, the reception of the decisions by a church assembly, by a synod or by a council. So the reception also of a council, of the decisions of a council, is also something which is going on and going on. Reception is in fact a never-ending story, an unfinished process of negotiating the meaning of a text, a church assembly, and so on. Reception is always about appropriation and identity. So the reception of councils has a very complex history, which opens up in the context of the concept of tradition and of the transmission of faith. This is how Hermann Joseph Sieben puts it. Hermann Joseph Sieben is a Jesuit scholar teaching in Germany in St. Georgen, close in part of Frankfurt, and he's a church historian, and he has written many books on councils and conciliarism. So he's one of the most important researchers of the history of councils, and he said that when he spoke about reception, that this reception is always a very complex history. And of course, you can adapt these ideas, what I'm saying now about reception, you can adapt this to the Council of Nicaea, but you can also think about reception of a synod or other big assemblies in the church, in your own church, maybe. And we know, of course, that the Nicene Creed has a difficult history of reception, and this difficult history of reception started right after the Council itself. And even today, the question of reception remains important, and it is challenging today again. And so I think maybe these celebrations of 700 years of Nicaea will maybe open up a new phase of reception of the Nicene Creed. It can be because we are dealing, we putting it on our agenda, so we are thinking, we are reflecting what this means. And of course, our context today is a very different context than 1700 years ago. And yet, it's also in some aspects very, very similar, because I think the whole question of division, the whole question of how you look in a very different way on these concepts, on the thinking on faith, on the thinking about God, and so on, I think that is maybe a sort of a similar or comparable context. So these are my preliminary thoughts and clarifications, and let me now come to speak about the significance of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea is of great significance for various reasons. First, there is a theological significance of its dogmatic decisions and solutions, but it also applies its ecclesial significance in broader sense. The Council of Nicaea, I quote, was not the first gathering of bishops in the history of Christianity to issue canonical legislation. We know that there have been several other synods or councils before. But Nicaea is considered as the blueprint for future church councils. In Nicaea, the concept of an ecumenical councils was invented, so to speak. Councils as an ecumenical councils including the whole inhabited world. And this at a time when Christianity was undergoing a comprehensive process of change that continued to develop over the course of the 4th century. So the 4th century, 325, of course, is a time when the Christian church is in a situation of change. And of course, from your lectures of church history, you know that this situation of change, or situations of change, sometimes grow very, very slowly. So in the situation of 325 of Christianity is only a beginning towards becoming a state accepted Christianity. So things change slowly. But there, in this situation, the role of the emperor, of course, is very important, because the emperor sees that only a unified, huge group like the Christian group there can be also of a big importance for his empire. So we know that the history of Nicaea goes far beyond the year 325. In my paper, I first will deal with the narratives by briefly discussing the formation of legends that began soon after 325, and then with different ways of receiving the council and its legacy. How do the Eastern and Western churches view this? Where are different aspects emphasized? My paper will look at this from today's perspective and from a more reflective point of view. So I will not tell you the whole story of the discussions of all the parties discussing at the council with each other, but I go directly a step further and start directly with the narratives about the council and the legends. And then at the end, I will come back to the question about the legacy of Nicaea today, and then I will give you a few thoughts about the Faith and Order World Conference which celebrates next year's the 700th anniversary of Nicaea. The legends. I must say, legends are not only legends. Legends are, of course, it's not about is it true or is it false. Legends give us an impression of what people at a certain point considered as important or central in a certain narrative. Of course, we know that we are not discussing now the historical facts and so on, so legends are tellings, are stories. But we know also from a historical point of view that legends contain some true ideas, some truth, which can only be transported by legends. So Hermann Josef Sieben, whom I mentioned in the beginning, Sieben, by the way, is written like the word 7 in Germany. So Hermann Josef Sieben has studied in detail the legends that arose about various councils of the early church, including the councils of the apostles, and such legends, alongside surviving council documents, are an important testimony to how the idea of the council developed, not only within the circle of the ecclesiastics, but also in a broader circle. However, such legends also have political potential and political explosive force, as for example the so-called Sylvester legend shows. I will come back to that. So first my part is legends about Nicaea. The historiographer Eusebius of Caesarea, first the name is already here. You might know him already from your study. Eusebius of Caesarea sometimes is called the first church historian. He made a significant contribution to the creation of legends about Nicaea. He wrote a life story of Emperor Constantine, the Vita Constantini. And he wrote this in 337, and he offers many points of reference for the creation of legends about Nicaea. His imperial Vita belongs to the genre of the panegyric, the hymn of praise to the emperor. The panegyric is a certain genre where it's a song, it's a written form of a laudatio to the emperor. So it is not primarily the historical truth that is of interest here, but the glorification of the emperor. To this end, Eusebius places the facts and the overall event in the aura of the unreal, the merely ideal. This is how he describes the universality of the synod. I quote, "Of all the churches which cover the whole of Europe, Libya and Asia, the most distinguished of the servants of God were assembled," he writes. So he describes all the churches, and then in his focus, of course, the whole of Europe, Libya and Asia, and then he says the most distinguished servants of God were assembled. These assembled bishops are described in an ideal way. Some, as I quote, "some stood out for their wisdom in speech, others for their strict conduct and enduring steadfastness, others for their modesty." Quote end. If you read this, you cannot imagine that there were any conflicts at the council. But of course there were. There was a lot of discussion. But you see, the interest of Eusebius is different. He wants to show how the process of coming together, of sharing the wisdom is going on. And then, as far as the role of the emperor is concerned, Constantine listens, as Eusebius writes, he listens to the disputing parties patiently and with eager attention. Eusebius places the emperor in the role of the mediator between the parties. He speaks to them, the emperor speaks to the parties in Greek. He appears friendly and obliging. He can convince some and shame others with his words. In the end, the emperor achieves, I quote, that they, the parties, were of one mind and one opinion on all disputed points. So what Eusebius, the interest of Eusebius is here indeed that the role of the emperor plays the role of the unifying power behind it. So the emperor is the person who listens, who is able to listen and to bring together the difference of minds. So he plays a huge role in that. And what is also interesting, by the way, is that the name of Arius, of course, was the main for some the main enemy, for the other the main important theologian. The name of Arius is never mentioned at all in this whole legend. That's also something. This is shows how you make choices when you tell stories. In 356, Athanasius of Alexandria reports how Arius affirmed his subscription to the council before Constantine, and then Athanasius, this is the famous Athanasius, I think you all know his name, the famous Athanasius, and then he documented in his own writing. Then after that, Arius went outside and collapsed here. Athanasius gives an even more dramatic account of the end of Arius a few years later. He writes that Arius collapsed in the latrina and he broke in two halves. What is told here, it's a very dramatic situation. You must imagine Arius he subscribes, and then he goes out and then goes to the latrina, and then he just, I don't know how I can tell it, but just breaks out and then he falls down and is dead. But what is told here is, of course, it's not the question if this had happened real, but what is told here is that it is like a sort of a reminiscent of a traitor. It is very reminiscent to the story of Judas, and it's told as a judgment of God. So God also knows who is on the right side with these thinking and so on. So it's very important that this story, how it is told by several Eusebius and others, is very clear who is the bad guy and who is the good guy. And even later, there were many reports about Nicaea in all kinds of letters and church histories. Many other legends about the council arose, and existing ones were widely embellished. Important here is another story by Gelasius of Caesarea, who wrote a church history in 396, Gelasius of Caesarea, and the text itself has not survived, but it can be reconstructed from other sources. We have that more often, that we do not have the text itself, but that because these texts are quoted in other sources, we can reconstruct stories. The role of the emperor is spun out further here. For example, the emperor gave a speech saying that the priests and bishop should concern themselves with divine matters and not with such disputes. So that the emperor is the person who really knows that the task of a true priest and a true bishop is not to make disputes, but to talk about divine matters. So it's also a very idealized image of the role of these churchmen. So this Gelasius of Caesarea is also the source of the legend about Arius being readmitted to the church. Because, so there you hear the other part of the story, of course, as you know, after the end of the Council of Nicaea, the emperor changed his mind, and he also stood along with Arius and the Arians. So and there is of course also a story behind that. And one of Gelasius knows to tell that it was the emperor's sister Constantia on her deathbed who asked her brother to allow Arius to return from exile as a last wish, and the brother could not say no to the last wish of his sister. So you see also here is a story where Arius came back, so it was the fulfilling of the wish. Of course, it was not Constantine himself who thought maybe the other party would be maybe politically better party. It was his sister on the deathbed. So you see that these are legends, and we learn a lot about the legends. We learn a lot about the point of view of the writer of the legend. And of course, in other legends have the tendencies that later legends put something else into the legend. So Socrates, Scholasticus, he published it 400 years later his writings, and he describes Arius more detailed, and he also describes many other aspects of Nicaea, which we do not know and heard earlier. So the conclusion to this part is the creation of legends should not be underestimated. It became part of the narrative about Nicaea. Today's more recent research on Emperor Constantine continues to see him as a key figure in the European religious history, like also Eusebius did and so on. But in the past, Constantine was often referred to as the father of the Christian West. This image has been shaken by, not least by Martin Wallraff's book on Constantine as the Sun King of late antiquity. The emperor who had the sun god as his religious model had a significant influence on his era. In religiously pluralistic antiquity, he was different in his Christianity than contemporary theologians would have liked and than many modern scholars imagined. So I think what today, when we discuss about Nicaea, when the role of the emperor is addressed, and many people would not understand why an emperor had such a powerful role at a church synod and a church council, then they do not know how this role of the emperor was, of course, embedded in the antique world in a whole other system. And for example, in his book, Martin Wallraff also points to that many modern scholars could not imagine how this role was indeed a role which was quite broadly to be understood. So, but he also says that Constantine's attitude towards Christianity was far more complex than many early Christian narratives reflect. Wallraff's thesis is that Constantine held to an integrative monotheism during his whole life. But the available sources are a fact. Eusebius is the main source, but it should be differentiated if Eusebius speaks and in which role Eusebius himself speaks. If Eusebius writes as the panegyric, the person who wants to give all the praise to Constantine, he writes in a different way than if he would speak or write as a theologian. So also the intention or the motivation for writing plays a role, how the role of Constantine is described. So the reception today of the Emperor Constantine is today in modern scholarship is seen in a sometimes even ambiguous way, because it is not so clear. Because also one sees also that, of course, the political reasoning behind the acts of Constantine should be also taken into consideration. As we have seen, Eusebius mainly describes the attitude of Constantine at the council, but he seems less interested in the theological content. And this is different if you look on texts from a Roman context. In the beginning, I go now in the 6th century, a few centuries later. In the beginning of the 6th century, there is a conflict between Symmachus and Laurentius, two Roman clergy, who both aim to become Bishop of Rome. Symmachus, at the end, wins the election. Laurentius gets a diocese elsewhere. But in the course of this conflict, there are texts produced by the party of Laurentius saying that the Bishop of Rome may not be judged by anybody. Now Bishop Sylvester comes into the picture, a contemporary of Emperor Constantine. In the 5th century, the legendary telling about Sylvester was invented. Sylvester contributed not only to the Christianization of the city of Rome, but he also would have healed Constantine from leper and would baptize him. This is told in the legend. And there was also a Sylvester Council. There was also a council called together by Sylvester was invented, in which also this council, in this council of Sylvester, it is referred to the Council of Nicaea. And it is told in this legend that under the presidency of Sylvester, a council in Rome is held which decides upon important questions like the date of Easter, like on dogma and so on. More bishops subscribe to this decision of the council in Rome, then to the Council of Nicaea. This Council of Nicaea is not mentioned at all. And in the second addition to this text, Nicaea then is mentioned. The role of Constantine is here not the role how we have seen it before. This is the emperor who is the mediator, who is the person who brings the council in shape and so on. But in this other legend, it is that the role of Constantine is here to support Sylvester. So the decisive authority here lies not with the emperor, but with the Bishop of Rome. And this idea will become a leading concept in the Liber Pontificalis. This is the book that contains the official history of the popes. And of course, this is fiction, but it will get influence in later historiography and history. So you see that we have here a different story told, which is not telling a different story about the role of Constantine, but also has a different view on the role of the Bishop of Rome at Nicaea, but also a different view on who decided, for example, on the Easter date and so on. All the issues which were discussed at Nicaea. Recent research thinks that the initiative for the Synod for Council of Nicaea was not taken by Constantine, but that he appropriated the idea of a synod to be held and moved his synod to Nicaea, which would be closer to his residence, so that he could participate as an emperor very easily to the council and exercise his influence on it. So recent research even questions this leading role of Constantine in the first place. So he was not the initiator of the council, but he played an important role. So you see that historical research sometimes make things much more complicated. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. But what is clear also from this modern research is that from the beginning, the Council of Nicaea was a highly political assembly. And I think that we can see also from the documents, from the text we have, because some bishops at this council wanted to continue with their anti-Arian policy, and others wanted, like Constantine, wanted to win back the unity of Christianity. What Nicaea found was a compromise, a brittle compromise, as we know from history. So Nicaea could not solve this question of unity in such a fundamental way like Constantine would have wished, but it paved the way to at least some confession most of the Christians today share. My next point would be the legacy of Nicaea, and I just want to say, not too long, something about the legacy of Nicaea in the Eastern Church and about the legacy of Nicaea in the Western Church. So the legacy of Nicaea in the Eastern Church, in Orthodox worship, for example, is huge. You can imagine that the question of Nicaea, that Nicaea is an ecumenical council, that the creed of Nicaea is to be confessed in every worship and so on. That is all without doubt. And Nicaea is in Orthodoxy seen, in the Eastern Church is seen as the first ecumenical council. And it is mentioned several times in the church calendar. And not only the council as such is commemorated, also the 380 fathers are commemorated, and so it has the Council of Nicaea in Orthodoxy has an important central place. For example, when an Orthodox bishop is consecrated, he has to give his adherence to the Nicene faith. He's praying, confessing the Nicene faith creed, but he's also signing it. And of course, then we have. So I think what we can see is that the Nicene faith has been something that the Orthodox Church, beginning from the 5th century, has taken for granted as its unshakable foundation. And the role of the emperor, of course, in Eastern Christianity was not questioned, because in Eastern Christianity for a long time you had this model of symphony, the symphony between the emperor and the highest ecclesiastical power, the patriarch, and that was not doubted at all. And you see that this role of the emperor still somehow be present, even maybe we do not recognize him anymore. So an Orthodox writer, Gavriluk, mentions this with respect to the Pan-Orthodox Council on Crete in 2016, where 4 local churches opted against attendance. But Crete considered itself as a holy and great council to signal its continuity with the Nicene faith, and not ecumenical, by the way. That would have been historically presumptuous and theologically erroneous, as Gavriluk states. So, but they saw this council in Crete in 2016 as in being in continuity with the Nicene faith. So you see, 2,000 years later, almost 2,000 years later, 1,700 years later, it's still the same model, still the same idea and concept of a church being in council, being assembling, which is a central idea of that this church then can indeed take decisions, because all churches, in this case all Orthodox churches except 4, are represented. So for the Orthodoxy in the Eastern Church, the legacy of Nicaea is emphasized. In the Western Church, the reception of the Nicene Council of Nicaea was a different. From a Roman Catholic perspective, means when you look from a Roman Catholic perspective how the Council of Nicaea was received, then as Jeffrey Dunn writes, you have to look at the bishops of Rome and how the Roman Catholic Church continued that reception. And as I already said, that in Rome you had some different emphasis, some different stories about the Council of Nicaea. The creed, the Nicene Creed, was not doubted. Well, thank you. But the way of the reception was different. But of course, it's also clear that for the average Roman Catholic, the Creed is encountered in the Eucharistic liturgy and is the only part of Nicaea generally known, but probably without much grasp of its historical or theological context. In the Eucharistic liturgy, in the end of the 6th century, this was emphasized. Of course, also in other parts of church life, for example, during the ritual of initiation or in the preparation of catechumens for people who would be baptized. It was cited. So Rome resisted for a long time to use the Creed in the Eucharistic liturgy. It was only in the 11th century that Pope Gregory VI agreed to follow the emperor's insistence that the Creed be introduced into the Roman liturgy. An earlier pope had written that Rome was not subject of the influence of heresies and had no need for the use of the Creed in the liturgy. What we can see from these quotations is that the Creed became part of the liturgy, was also, the Nicene Creed became part of the liturgy, was also part of discussion. It was not clear from the beginning that it should be automatically included. And the argument by Pope Gregory is interesting, that he agreed on the one hand to include this into the liturgy after he had some discussion with the Byzantine emperor about it. So you see that still in the 11th century the contact between the Eastern and the Western Church is there, and that the Pope is not sort of a single person without a sort of a counterpart in the state and represented by the emperor. But also this earlier pope who had written, we do not need the creed because we do not know heresies here. So the creed, and that is also an interesting point, that the creed was also used to prove your orthodoxy, your correct belief in that. And that is, of course, says something also about the function of the creed in the liturgy. And I think also if today people have, bishops or other persons have to sign the creed especially, then this is indeed also a signal that you subscribe to the faith of the church, how it is delivered from the beginnings. I will skip, because of the time, I will skip the whole question of the insertion of the filioque, which would give us some more discussion. But I just want to quote. No, I don't. I just wanted to quote somebody, but I don't do that. I come to my conclusion of this part. The reception of Nicaea is always intertwined with the emperor, or with the function of the emperor, which in the Western Church was taken not only by an emperor, but also by other powers like the Pope and other rulers. So it is also in this, the whole question of the creed, the Nicene Creed, has always had political impact, political relationship. It's never alone a prayer like you maybe today would understand a prayer as a purely personal thing. It always has this collective importance, this collective meeting for the whole of the group, for the whole of the church. And it's always a sort of under dispute, because it's also a signal if you pray or confess the creed. And today, therefore, it is interesting that the questions of the emperor or the imperial context play such a high role for some people. We are not used anymore that the state has more than just a common interest in the matters of the church. We are impregnated by the view of the separation of state and church in a modern way. We fear the interference of the state into religious affairs, maybe. I say this from a point of view of a Swiss context. I do not know how you look towards this from a Czech context. But looking to antiquity, the situation is different from ours. Looking into the Middle Ages, we see also this model of symphony in the East, and in the West, we see a dispute on the investment in the 11th and 12th century between the empire and the imperium and the sacerdotium, the empire and the ecclesiastical power, the spiritual and the temporal power. We see also the dispute on the role of councils and their relationships with papal power, which is visible mainly in the time of the so-called conciliarism in the 15th century. And in the West, with the Reformations in Europe, there are other models of being church and church structure. All of this shapes the role of the emperor, if there is one, and the ambiguous views of the governor as a worldly leader. Today, in ecumenical discussions on the reception of Nicaea within a time of post-colonialism, the question of the role of the emperor gets a distinct sound and a new aspect. And I want to conclude my paper with my emphasis in this paper was, of course, with the role of the emperor in the whole process of the propagation of the Council of Nicaea. But as you might have seen, the role of the emperor was mainly a political impact. It was not so much a purely religious interest in that. And I think if we today discuss about the creed of the Nicene or the Nicene faith, I think, of course, especially if we are theologians or church historians, our interest maybe in the Nicene faith and in the Nicene creed maybe I have also other aspects to include than only this very political part in it. And so at the end I want just to say that when the Commission of Faith and Order of the World Council of Churches decided about 4 years ago that in 2025 it would be time to hold a world conference of faith and power, faith and order again, then it was also inspired not so much by these political ideas and questions with the council, but it was also mainly inspired by the idea that having or confessing a faith, a creed together as churches would be also a possibility to go further on the way towards unity between the churches. And even, I think, even if this creed is contested, because as I said in the beginning, when we prepared in Switzerland, when we are working on the preparation of this evensong of the 1st of June, then we discussed also, is it possible that we invite several choirs from several traditions, and all these choirs in their way sing the creed or confess the creed, so we will have maybe six times the creed in this evensong. Will that be possible? And it was very interesting that the Orthodox member said, yes, of course, we send our choir and he can sing a beautiful creed in Orthodox way. And then also the Roman Catholic participant in this group said, yes, of course, we can do it, and we will have to talk about how we do it. And then the person from the Reformed Church says, okay, we do not have a creed in our church because the Reformed Church of Switzerland does not officially have one creed, but of course you are able to pray a creed, even if you do not do it every week. So there was also an opening there, and the representative from the free churches who was there, I found his answer the most interesting and the most intriguing, because he said, you know, when I go to my congregation and I tell them that we will have something like that, and we have to prepare ourselves by talking about this creed, this will be, by some will think this is a strange thing what we are doing, because we are not so much interested in history and we are not so much interested in texts of the tradition. But I will try to talk with my people about it, and then we will also try to think about how this text is related to the Bible and to biblical story. So I think also, and I found this, as I said, very intriguing, because I could feel how that his way was taking him further than alone saying yes or no. He has also to think about how to do it. But at the end I thought, if this would be a possibility to, at the end, that on 1st of June we can have this evensong together, and before that and after that this leads to some more reflection on what really is connecting us as Christians from different traditions, then I think it is really a way to work on the legacy of Nicaea and to work on the re-reception of the Nicene Creed. Thank you very much.